Goblins are one of the oldest and most iconic fantasy archetypes. They are so ingrained in our culture that even people who know nothing about fantasy will immediately get some sort of picture in their mind when you mention goblins. Most people will imagine a short creature with pointy features and a penchant for being mischievous at best. This basic Platonic ideal of a goblin became so ingrained that the trend of going goblin mode emerged in some circles. The idea of embracing our most primal instincts, and frankly, I'm not quite sure why it's goblin mode, really, since I'd have called it something more like caveman mode, but the basic representation of this goblin mode is as this basically bestial creature skulking and grunting and just taking whatever it wants. I understand why this may seem appealing to some people in some situations as a form of releasing the masks and expectations society puts on us and just letting the animal out, but still in a controlled environment. The real question today, though, is why we call this goblin mode. What really is a goblin? As usual in these videos, even with the races you don't expect, the origin of the concept can be traced back to the idea of the fair folk. As I've talked about in the previous videos, categorizing various fantasy races, the fair folk in the myth were more than just your modern image of pixies. It described basically all kinds of hidden creatures, characters that lived in a magical world hidden from our eyes, a world closer to nature, a way to explain the unexplainable, to tell us why someone's keys disappeared, because a goblin hid it somewhere. It is a cultural trend not exclusive to Europe, and virtually every culture in the world had a similar idea. And not all the fairies were all fun and games. Some could be actually pretty nasty. Good examples of the goblins of other cultures are satyrs and the Vanara. Satyrs represented the idea of this primal man with no sense of restraint or decorum, and were closely tied to the Bacchanalia, a festival that essentially allowed people to go goblin mode for a short time. The Vanara are less outrageous, not by much, but being monkeys in India, literally monkeys, not just monkey people, they were literally originally monkeys. They also show a very human-looking creature with none of our social mores, and a lot of their stories are stories of Sun Wukong from China, probably related conceptually to Vanara, show us that same primal humanoid concept. Goblin is a word that comes probably from the 12th century, and they were one of the nastier sides of the fair folk. Though it originally described a demon, this was the Middle Ages. Everything they didn't understand was a demon. Over the centuries, because the word had this mischievous association, this idea started mixing with and merging with more traditionally nasty fays, such as boggarts. By the 19th century, we get to the more modern concept of this short, often hairy, pointy creature that tricks people out of malice. Almost always I have to do at least a brief foray into Tolkien, and in this case it's no different. Goblins first appear in The Hobbit, though as it was difficult to understand for the 10-year-old me at the precipice of centuries, they were not a different creature from the orcs in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien described them as goblins in one book and then orcs in the other, and then the child me already had an idea of a goblin from somewhere, probably some cartoon or something, so I just assumed they were shorter, and many people to this day have this idea, probably influenced by the decades of pop culture sense. But it's important to note that this was not the original intention. Goblins and orcs were the same thing. For more on Tolkien's goblins, check my orc video, because, they're orcs. Early D&D editions, and goblins appeared right from the get-go, takes the idea of goblins from The Hobbit and uses them as one of the most basic and most iconic monsters, really separate from orcs for the first time. Sure, orcs were still defined as goblinoid up to, I think, 2nd edition AD&D, but the two started getting their own cultures, the goblins diverging from Tolkien and delving more into that nasty fae side. Goblins are chaotic, not by alignment, but more by behavior, crude, clever in their own way, making for the perfect mooks for the early dungeon-crawling games that didn't really explore the implications of their worlds. It was already in 2nd edition that goblinoids started getting their own variants that may have taken names and hints from other folklore creatures, but really took on their own shape. The two most recognizable goblinoids to this day are hobgoblins and bugbears. And I always found the name of the hobgoblin to be one of the weirdest parts here. The original hobs were the friendlier creatures, and here they become the taller, more militaristic goblins. It seems like a very strange leap, which I'm not sure where it came from. Bugbears, on the other hand, are larger and bulkier, and you'd be excused for thinking they were the replacement for orcs as goblinoids, but they also have this weird stealth thing, because of the name implying being boogeymen. All of these made for a very interesting goblinoid ecology, but they weren't really goblins anymore. 3rd edition, of course, introduced a lot of environmental variants. Aquatic goblins, desert goblins, jungle goblins, but as you may know from the previous videos, I rarely count these among the variants because 9 times out of 10 the culture is the same, only they live in water on the desert now. I think the most interesting variants to come from the 3rd edition were the Vril and the Blues. Both are pretty obscure, but let me explain. While Vril do live in the Underdark, they are a little more than just cave goblins. They have purple skin, they have these bat-like features, they have sonic screams, and all of this is because they were basically genetically engineered by the Drow, and then rebelled. In classic D&D they are still very goblin-like, only more organized and bolder. I think they have some very unique points scored for their appearance and their origin at least, and so they could be a lot more, but sadly I don't think they will ever take off as a major variant. Blues were the psionic variant of goblins in the few psionic D&D books in 3rd edition, and though they do appear distinct, I feel like the game treats them more like a random mutation of existing goblins than a genuine subrace. The way they are described rising randomly and being bullied by other goblins, but also being raised into these advisory magical roles in society, it feels like the description of albinos in Africa, who are, the same human race as everyone else in Africa or elsewhere. They could do so much more with these. Make a subrace, actual subrace, a race of goblins that has a greater insight into people, is more clever, more manipulative, still goblin-like in other ways, but more social. Essentially, make them Yoda. Weird and mischievous, but also powerful and wise. It has great potential, but it's far too obscure, and I don't think D&D will ever pick them up again. I think the last thing to talk about when it comes to goblins in D&D is the controversy coming with them being categorized as fey lately. While the idea of goblins comes from the fair folk, so I don't hate it on principle, I think it comes with a larger wave of trying to recategorize creatures into non-humanoids. Like, for example, gnolls as fiends. It's like they heard the complaints about always evil humanoids being a bad idea and decided to take the complete wrong lesson from it. And instead of making the humanoids more morally complex, they decided to say, oh look, they were always monsters after all, so they don't have to be complex. We don't have to think about the implications. Okay. This is completely the opposite way of what you should be doing with that, but anyway. I'm sure it could work in some worlds, but in a setting agnostic, monster manual-like presentation, this should be more neutral. While on the subject of D&D, I will take a brief foray into the closely related Pathfinder. Goblins, of course, exist in Pathfinder, and the most basic variant of goblin drops a lot of the malice inherent to the concept of D&D goblins, and they embrace the most chaotic and mischievous parts of the idea. They are still scavengers, they are thrill-seekers, they are described as loving two things first and foremost, song and fire. To me, these read a lot more like that Chaos Goblin or Goblin Mode idea than the generic mooks of typical D&D. Pathfinder does have some variants of goblins, like environmental variants again, or monkey goblins with tails, but they don't really differ culturally that much. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Starfinder and the Skittermanders, who are essentially space Chaos Goblins. They're adorable little gremlins who are very chaotic, very unconstrained by the mores of our society. Whether you count Starfinder as fantasy, they definitely seem to fit the bill, even though they don't really look like goblins. But they definitely have the appearance down pat. If we are talking about life-loving goblins who like to chuck fire everywhere, I have to go to the setting I'm most familiar with. Warcraft. Warcraft goblins seem like one of the most unique ones because while on the surface they are a lot like the other varieties, being the Chaos Goblins, they were, to the best of my knowledge, the first goblins in fantasy to really focus on technology. It didn't come out of nowhere. The Tinker Gnomes of Dragonlance, a setting many Warcraft writers were fans of, are a clear conceptual ancestor as much as the Grinskins of Warhammer 40k, who include the diminutive Gretchens, but I couldn't really find tech goblins in fantasy, exactly, before Warcraft 2. Warcraft's goblins certainly had their influence on pop culture, such as the aforementioned Pathfinder goblins, who were undoubtedly influenced by Warcraft, only made to fit a lower-level technology of Golarion. We've also seen a far greater expansion of goblin culture in the years since. While goblins were always greedy merchants in Warcraft, since Cataclysm their greed has been expanded into a whole culture focused on gold and money in a way reminiscent of modern American consumerism more than any implications that some people sometimes see in goblins. I will get back to that. And I think this was one of the best ways they could handle it, and really gave Warcraft goblins a really unique profile, a very relatable profile to me. Honestly, the Warcraft goblins are one of my favorite races ever, if anything. There was a video idea at one point that was just like, I love Warcraft goblins. They can definitely be the subject of their own video, but I don't think anyone would watch that. Let me know if you would, though. Goblins or goblin-like creatures of course exist in plenty of settings, in different forms, but they will either be the same basic goblin patterns or they will be barely recognizable as goblins. I do have some honorable mentions though. The Elder Scrolls does technically have goblins, and while they do seem to be more on the savage mook side, they also seem to be somewhat chimp-like. It almost harkens back to that Vanara concept, only apes and not monkeys, but they are very much in the background. There was the story about the Goblin Gate releasing these actually smart, huge ancient goblins, but we really do not know how much of it is even canon or true. There is actually a second goblin, quote-unquote, race in Elder Scrolls, and that's the Falmer. The former snow elves have been turned into these goblin-like blind creatures by the Dwemer, the dwarves of the Elder Scrolls. They definitely behave and look a lot like the typical fantasy goblins, but they are technically elves, just like, almost everything that isn't human in this setting. I thought it was worth a mention, though. I wanted to also mention Dragon Age because in probably just one DLC of one game, they bring up creatures they call ghasts. They don't look like ghasts of D&D, instead they are very goblin-like in appearance and behavior, and we know very little about them, or where they came from. Given how dead the setting seems to be right now, as much as I'd like it to continue, we will probably never learn more. Of course, there are goblins in both Warhammers, but in fantasy they're rather stereotypical goblins, and in 40k the Gretchens do have technology, like the orcs, but they also seem to be not extremely developed. I think I have to address one point before I finish. Quite often I see the idea that goblin appearance and behavior is an anti-Semitic caricature. While it is certainly true for some people, some writers I shall not name, I do not believe that goblins in general came from those stereotypes. The pictures of goblins having these hooked, pointed appearances are very old and stem from some very primal fears, things that seem odd and unnatural, things we associate with the Fae. They may end up looking like anti-Semitic caricatures, but here's the thing about both goblins and those caricatures. They don't actually look like real Jewish people. Real Jewish people look, unsurprisingly, like humans. Racists, much like other humans, feared the same things, the odd jagged shapes, and they saw them in people they feared and exaggerated them in their caricatures. So I posit that goblins look like anti-Semitic caricatures coincidentally. I don't think that just because some shitty people took those ideas to use for their racism, we should be abandoning the looks and ideas of goblins, because there is a lot of cultural heritage that we can still use in our fantasy by stripping it of the things that bad people try to associate them with. I mean, how often do you see goblins actually be moneylenders? Yes, that's the one big example on the picture, which I hate. But how many others can you name? Like, this is a genuine question, by the way. How many other goblin moneylender types can you actually name? So in the end, what do I think are the major subraces of goblins we can distill from these settings? Firstly, the primal goblins, who are the stereotypical mooks who possess the low beastly cunning, as someone D&D put it, who swarm in large numbers, produce nothing, and raid others to survive. And they often look more grey and brown, like the more primal types of orcs. Secondly, the tinker goblins, who love songs and fire and explosions and will create new technologies to make their lives longer and everyone else's shorter. These are your WoW and Pathfinder goblins, often more green than the others for some reason. And I do think at the very least the blues have a potential to be something more. If someone digs them up from the very obscure old edition books and decides to do something more with them. Vrail could also be something more, but again, they are very obscure. What I do find fascinating about goblins in general is that they seem like how elves view humans. A short-lived, quick-breeding race with a low bestial cunning and a penchant for destruction, a penchant for creating new, dangerous technology that can bring us down. If elves embody our fear or appreciation of things older than us, goblins are what we fear replaces us, as we replaced those who came before us. I think this will be it for this one. Have I missed any major examples of goblins in fantasy? Ones that differ greatly from the two major subraces I ended up with in the end? Do you also think some minor goblin subrace somewhere deserves a greater spotlight, like the blues? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to find yourself among these fine folks here, you can join the channel membership and get new videos early. I hope you enjoyed this look at where goblin mode comes from, and I hope to see you next time.